Welcome to Season 4 of Grieving Common. You're listening to different voices from the Winston Swish youth team.
We're a group of grieving young people who are helping to shape the future of grief support.
We're all different, but we've all got grief in common. If you are aged 13 or over, this podcast is suitable for you.
Winston Swish is a charity that supports children and young people who are bereaved or facing the death of someone important to them. And this podcast is our space to talk honestly about what that feels like.
We'll be sharing our ideas, experiences and conversations that we hope will help you feel less alone. If you'd like to help us keep this going, you can donate at winstonswish.org. Thank you.
In this episode of Grief in Common, we mention terminal illness, cancer, chemo and radiology, and we talk about death and grief throughout.
Welcome back to Grief in Common. I'm Miranda. You probably heard or seen me on some Winston Swish things before, and today is a very exciting, slightly different type of episode. I am joined by Emily, who taught me at high school and was my main source of support throughout the whole of high school because she was my form tutor, and then various promotions, one thing led to another, and she ended up knowing me my whole time and was amazing. And I mean, this is kind of coming off the back of the Ask Me campaign, which we launched in November to try to help more schools and colleges and things like that know how best to support young people who've been bereaved. Because what I discovered once I joined Winston Swish was that most people did not have the same support that I did, and I was kind of surprised by that because I'd been in my little bubble at my school where everyone knew me and everyone was amazing, and it should be something that everyone has equal access to. So we wanted to get Emily on the podcast and see how she did it.
Hello, so my name's Emily. I am a secondary school teacher. I met Miranda when she was 11 as her year 7 form tutor, and she was very sweet even then. And then I think I was your form tutor until year 9, wasn't I? And then I got a job in the 6th form, but for sort of continuation of support, I just continued to be Miranda's point of contact, whatever it's called, in school. And then when she got into 6th form, I rigged the system, so I became her sort of 6th form pastoral lead as well. I was like, it makes life easier, so we did that. So I've known her a really long time. I'm really enjoying this podcast host alter ego. I think this could be a long-term profession for you, Miranda. So I was absolutely thrilled, over the moon, when she wanted to talk to me about it. I'm interested in obviously her perspective, because when we talk now, because we're still in touch, we talk a lot about where she is now. And I think this is the first time we'll have kind of looked back. And I think because of the nature of school and what we were trying to achieve for you, particularly in that year after you lost your dad, we were always thinking forward. And I don't think we ever really had a chance to look back. So I've been thinking a lot about it myself. So I'm really interested to see what we talk about today, Miranda's perspective on things, and hopefully give some advice to other professionals, because teaching is not easy and you want to get it right, and it's so important to get it right. And you're dealing with people, particularly when it comes to grief, at one of the most vulnerable points they'll probably ever experience in life, and that just happens to be in their childhood, which is heartbreaking in many ways. But actually my motivation is still today in the role that I'm in today, because I work with little ones now, not little ones, but they're 11 and 12, so I work with year 7s, but always has been just to make life as good as it possibly can be, and to help them navigate some of the tricky things in life, which we've had our fair share of, haven't we, navigating?
Yeah, so for context, one of the ways that, I'm not actually sure if this is true, but one of the ways that you may have been able to rig the system is that my dad worked at my school. He was the head of 6th form, and it was the summer between year 12 and 13 when he died. So as you might be able to imagine, it was like maybe slightly different to some other people's experiences, in that it wasn't just my school, it was also my dad's workplace. All the teachers knew him. It meant that all the children had to be told, things like that. But that obviously also means that Emily did know my dad and worked with him, which was really cool and really nice. I think, especially whilst I was there, I felt like our school community was very like quite close, really, and quite very important for not just me but also my whole family, as you would expect it to be, because it is a death within the school community. But yeah, it was definitely like the main place to go, and one of the main places we had so much contact with afterwards. So yeah.
Do you think that, I don't know if this is what you want to talk about, was it harder that he worked there and that I knew him? Like, or what did that make, or was it a bit of both?
I think it was a bit of both. I think that there was no way that it couldn't be hard, because I felt like everyone, I mean, I think probably a lot of grieving young people feel this anyway. But when I went back to school, I felt like everyone was like looking at me because everybody knew, which they had to. And like something that maybe we'll talk about in a minute is that me and my family had a lot of input in like how they were told, for example. And I went and hid in Emily's office whilst the like online assembly happened, where they had to obviously say something about it. They were so good, everyone at school, Emily included, about just checking that what they were doing about it was okay. Like how you tell the whole school community. And we went in and like me and my mum were there when they sort of drafted the email, and it was like, things like that. We had input the whole way, really, which I think is very valuable, because even just my whole family are very into like language and things. My dad was an English teacher, and we we were quite particular about what we wanted to say and what we didn't want to say.
I remember, yeah.
Yeah.
We made sure we got those commas right.
Yeah.
The grammar was spot on in any correspondence. Yeah. Okay, that's interesting.
It was just very important that we had a say in it, but also I think it was easier because I didn't have to tell anyone. Like I told my friends, obviously, but until I left school, I didn't have to start telling people about my dad. It wasn't a case
Yeah.
of every time you go to school, are people going to wonder about this and that? Like once the sort of news was out, it was out, and I could kind of, people sort of knew, and I could kind of say like, oh, I can't come to this class because I've got, like, to other people my age in sixth form, I can't come to this class because it's my dad's funeral. Like I was kind of saying that, and it wasn't as big of a thing as it would be if they didn't know.
Yeah.
If you see what I mean.
And I remember, and again, you can tell me, obviously I'm conscious that a lot of our conversations, we never intended to go on a podcast. But look, here we are. That was one of your big worries about going out into the world, that you had to tell people and having to manage their reactions to it, and almost manage their uncomfortableness about grief, because it's not something that people are always keen to lean into, are they? And I remember you saying that there'll be a point where you'll be going to university and having to be like, well, this happened, and deal with that awkwardness, I suppose. You were a very specific situation. I think a lot of the stuff we did for you, we would, or I would do for any child in that situation. But you're right, the fact that a lot of us knew your lovely dad anyway made things complicated in one way. I remember lower school and people were asking you about how he was, and you didn't like that all the time. But then actually, yeah, I went around and being like, stop asking her. She doesn't want to talk about it right now. But actually, after obviously you lost him, that meant that you didn't have to go around telling people all the time. Yeah.
I'll go sort of chronologically, and we'll talk about the first few weeks, if that's okay.
Mhm.
So I'll talk about my experience, and then if you feel comfortable to talk about what your thoughts were and what to do and how you were feeling about it and things like that. So my dad died in the summer holidays, which again, I think everything with school would have gone a lot differently had it not been the summer holidays, because we kind of had a little bit of space and time. Like, I don't really know because it just didn't happen that way, but I might have missed a lot more school had it not been the summer holidays, because I didn't have to go back for a month. Who knows? I didn't miss a lot of school anyway. Everyone's very different about that. But beforehand, he wasn't very well, and people were kind of in the loop about that. Some people were in the loop to support me, like you, and some people were in the loop because they worked more closely with my dad. So there was some people that were in the loop, but then because it was the summer holidays, everything was like kind of a bit more, calm calm in the community. But I remember, I think my mum told the person who works closest with my dad, and then I think a couple of days later, I got an email from Emily, as was quite normal, to be fair, because if just logistically, it was a very big school and quite a big sixth form, and I had got an email that was basically like, whatever you need, I'm here, I'll be your safety net. It also included a story about your cats, which I really thought was brilliant. So, yeah, and I remember that, and I just remember thinking, it was really nice to have someone acknowledge what had happened, and it was also good because you'd been supporting me that whole time, and it was good to know that it was obviously going to continue. I don't think I ever had any doubt, but I think it's always good for people to say. And yeah, this is kind of, with the Ask Me campaign, we want to encourage like an open conversation about what support's available and things. And so it was very reassuring to know that when I did go back and things, that I could rely on Emily for the same thing as always. And then we had a meeting a couple of weeks later because everything felt complicated because he worked there and things. And also for me, I think, to figure out how I was going to navigate it. And yeah, we just went and sat and talked about it. And at the time as well, the first term of year 13 is quite full of uni applications usually. So obviously I had been thinking about that in the summer beforehand and everything, but everything had been very chaotic, and we sort of maybe also had that meeting to discuss that a little bit, because everything, when you lose someone, everything gets thrown up in the air basically. We chatted and we decided that I was going to take a gap year, which was the best decision I could have made because I just don't think it was a good idea for me personally to do the whole uni application process in the immediate aftermath. But I know that for other people that can be very different. And yeah, and then when I did go back, the story of the whole rest of that year is basically that Emily was amazing at saying, right, if you need me, come and find me. She had a little office that year under the stairs.
Like Harry Potter.
Bobby, yeah. But in previous years, it's just her classroom, things like that. If you need me, come and find me, and we'll sit and talk. And I don't know how many hours we would have spent doing that, but I cannot explain how important it was, because I just, I love my family, of course, but being at home was very hard, as was being at school in a way. But I think from COVID and things like that, it had become school had become more of a safe place because I had my friends there and I had Emily there to go and chat to. And I just think that the best thing that Emily did was to just offer a listening ear, really. And also give me advice, because a lot of the time I would sit there and go, I have no idea how I'm feeling, and just, cry. A lot of crying on my part. But you need somewhere where you can do that without being judged or having to sort of deal with it in public. I could always go and it would be nice and private and just chill. And yeah, I would know that even if I didn't know what to say, but I knew I needed to have a chat, then she would be very patient. Yeah, I could just basically say anything about my grief. Like, I remember, I don't know, I don't remember any of the other conversation. I just remember sitting there and going, it's 2 months today. I could just sort of yap, basically. And that was very helpful. And then I will stop waffling in a minute and we will hear about Emily's experience.
Your waffle is like poetry. My waffle is like blah, 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 blah. Anyway, sorry, carry on.
Not true. Not
Well,
true.
thank you.
The other part of the support that I got after my dad died, I think a huge part of it was kind of having a port of call to be communication with other teachers, because again, when you're in that setting, you've got a lot to deal with and a lot of sort of people you're going to be interacting with. And although we had initially sent emails and stuff, I still had my classes to be doing, and I was I mean, I never needed to be worried, because all of my teachers were very lovely and very understanding. But I was worried about summer work that I hadn't done, or keeping up, or just generally how I was going to manage, because you don't know when you've first gone back how it's going to go, really. Although my teachers were all quite approachable and very understanding, it takes a lot of energy out of you to be doing all of those conversations and trying to say, I don't know if I can finish this, or just trying to tell them that you're worried about this, or that you're not going to finish this, or you don't want to be in this lesson. I could just kind of tell Emily that, and she'd be like, right, I'll send an email, don't you worry, which was very helpful. And I think it's always good, again, to have that open communication to make sure that everyone's on the same page. I remember saying that at the start when we were thinking about ideas for the Ask Me campaign. One bereaved student will be interacting with a lot of different teachers, and if there can be a possible way to have people on the same page about what they need or don't need, or even if they don't know, just try and keep it updated if possible. I remember saying that was really important. I am super interested in how you knew how to go about it and what your thoughts and feelings were around everything.
So I must have emailed you on day 2 for you, but for me that was day like 0. Does that count? So I'd heard a couple of weeks before that your dad wasn't very well, and then that's a bit euphemistic, isn't it? I heard that he was in intensive care, not just under the weather. He's in intensive care. I just had a feeling. That things weren't good. And then Kim called me and told me what had happened. I think she'd waited about a day, because I think maybe your mum had said, we haven't told everybody yet. So she obviously, understandably, didn't want people to find out in a way that wasn't the right way. So directly from her, or from, whatever means that she wanted that information to be shared. I think when you're a teacher and when you really care about young people, as I cared and care about you, you want to fix it. And it's your instinct. And supporting you through that was really hard, because I knew from a very early on point that this wasn't something that I could fix. And the only way, and I'm used to doing that, and that's why I like my job. I can go in, right, they've got a problem with this, let me sort that, let me refer to this agency, let me get this involved. But the fundamental problem with something like grief, you can't fill that void. You just can't. So I got the phone call and I thought, right, I need to reach out to her. But then what I did in that email, I can't really put stuff about my cat. But the reason I did that, it was method to a madness. It's a bit like tearing the plaster off, isn't it? And I think, just going back to what we said before, I think talking about grief is really uncomfortable. And I think for a lot of people, they don't want to upset somebody. Obviously, you're already upset, so it's not going to make it any worse, is it? It's really hard to know the right thing to do. So I wanted you to know that you could still come to me, as you had been doing, and that I knew, and I wanted to say how sorry I was that it happened, and that I was going to be a safety net and all that sort of stuff. But I also wanted you to have a sort of off ramp, that if you wanted to talk about something different, like if you didn't want to talk about that, you just wanted to chat to me about random stuff like my cats, which became a bit of a go-to, didn't it? Like if we just needed to change the topic and be like, right, let's start talking about this. And I think advice to all teachers, and this is something that underpins everything in teaching, doesn't it? Having that relationship really helps. So knowing that child, sometimes with grief, I suppose you can, it's something potentially could be happening if you have a, terminal diagnosis or something like that. I suppose when it's an unexpected death, that's different. But what you'd hope in all schools is that actually, if you've got those, and I think that's what our school's really good at doing, is giving teachers the space to build those relationships, and it means when things happen, when bad things happen, that you've got the foundations there to put in that support. Knowing those little silly things that make them laugh, or knowing what their hobbies are and what, you know, they like to talk about, and just daft stuff like that. You know, humor gets you a long way. I think having that as a sort of plan B, if the plan A of talking about the grief is too much, or it's not the right day, or you just need to not be in that headspace, you can do that. And then we met in school. Remember giving you a big hug, thinking, is this a bit weird? Is she going to be weird with it? Well, I'm doing it. Oh no, I'm doing it. And the same with your mum. And obviously sitting down and talking about next steps. And ultimately, that was always going to be led by you. And I suppose it depends where children are in their school journey. If we're talking about primary, it's very different, because I suppose a lot of those next steps are decided by the adults in their lives in terms of secondary school and things like that. Whereas it seemed for you to fall at a very poignant, it was a crossroads, wasn't it? And I know we'd been talking about university and what your options were with that. What can we do in this moment? Like, what do we anticipate they're going to need from us? Obviously, there's the unknowns, things we didn't know that you were going to need. But what do we know? When you said that you didn't want to do that, I did instinctively think that was the right thing, and you did too. And I was like, right, okay, that's good, because it gives you the headspace to be able to process everything else that's going on in your life without having to think about university. And I was also super excited about the idea of you having a gap year and traveling and seeing things and doing stuff for you. There was a few spooky occasions where I just sort of stumbled across you in tears. It's like I was popping up out of nowhere, and it genuinely wasn't anything. It was just like, oh, here I am. And you were just like, oh, you're here. And I was like, I am here. You were like, oh, this is so spooky.
I'm on the brink of tears and you appear.
And I appear, yeah, in my corridor bumbling around. Yeah, it was always very much led by you and what you needed. So those conversations, there were some days where you needed to cry. And again, fine. Some days you needed to be distracted and we just talk about life. Great. Some days you needed to be angry. And I encourage that, because I think for you, again, without going into too much detail, your personality is you're so conscientious and aware of other people's feelings, that when something would annoy you or you'd be a bit peed off, that you'd feel that feeling and then you'd beat yourself up for feeling that feeling. And I think have given you the space to feel that, and for me to be like, yeah, that is rubbish and I would be annoyed at that, and that's fine, was important. There's no blueprint for it though, is there? You know, every time you knocked on my office door or you agreed to meet, I didn't know what you were gonna say, and there's no way to prep for that. And I suppose for other teachers, my best advice is just know the children. And I suppose the position I'm in now, if I had a child in my year group again, although they'd be a lot younger, is that person might be me. I might be the best person for that kid to speak to, but it might not be. And I think a bit like what we did when you were a bit younger in school, which is basically rig the system. And again, had your dad worked there or not, I would have been there being like, excuse me, I think this is for the best. I think identifying a person that has a strong relationship with them, that has, I suppose, got those foundations, that means that when they start talking, you can there's a trust there, isn't there? And I think we were in a very good position, because we had years of building that trust up, that you knew that when you came to me, that I would, if I said I was going to do something, or if you had a big feeling, I wasn't going to recoil from it. There were definitely points where you'd left and I just felt just so heartbroken for you. And again, going back to that thing where I was like, I can't fix it, and I want to fix it, and I want to just come in and problem solve and cheer you up and, you know, give you a biscuit and off you go. I could do a lot of kids, but I could never do that. So that was a challenge, but not one that I shied away from or would ever shy away from again. And actually seeing, not that it's all about what it's given me, so emotional. Seeing you, you know, go on now and thrive and go on a gap year and be a university student and doing this, like, I just think amazing. And if I played even a tiny part in it and giving you the confidence or giving you, you know, the space, or I don't know, any contribute even a slightest bit to this, then all worthwhile to see where you are now. And obviously it's not a finished process, and I'm sure that you still have a lot of feelings, as you always will. But yeah, it's a very worthwhile use of my time in that little Dobby cupboard.
Yeah, well, for the record, like, you did contribute to this, and quite directly, because people were like there's not that many of us when we talk about it with a positive experience, and people just say, you know, I didn't have much communication, or people just didn't know what to do with me, or, you know, like, aside from the unfortunate mistakes and general sort of insensitivities that sometimes happen, I think a lot of people's sort of negative experiences with grief support was just the lack of it. And I think that's why it was so important when I ended up sort of saying, yeah, like, I had really good support. And then, you know, we latched onto it because we were like, hold on, this is actually amazing. And it's such a shame that other people haven't had that. You know, when I'm doing the Winston's Wish things, I think, or I say, like, I'm not really sure where I would be had I not had such an open outlet of communication like that, because I think it's very important overall in life to just be open about things, which obviously led to me being part of Winston's Wish, but also, yeah, I think it's been crucial, really. So, big thank you. I've written you many thank you cards over the years, but
Still got them on my wall. So when people are saying negative things, is it that they just didn't, like, people just ignored it? What sort of stuff are they saying?
so what a lot of the other people on the Winston's Wish team say is that a lot of the support just wasn't there. I think a lot of the time they maybe weren't reached out to, or maybe I think a lot of it as well is sometimes it's assumed what people need. I know one girl on the youth team, they had decided that she was going to repeat the year, and that wasn't really her decision, but she was still kind of sixth form age or something like that. And I think they just weren't involved in the decisions about what they did with their education, or the conversation wasn't open. So I think that's the difference between my really positive experience and people's not so positive experiences in general.
Sometimes, and at some schools, well, okay, I suppose that's two different things. Let's talk about the individuals. I think sometimes individual teachers are, shock, newsflash, everybody, also human. And I think that there comes a point when you get to your adulthood, isn't there, where you realise that grown-ups also make mistakes and aren't just doing the right thing, and because they're grown up, because they're adults. I think grief is something that humans, and therefore also teachers, will find hard to talk about. And I think people naturally, I think visible displays of emotion can make people uncomfortable. I'm sure this has all been talked about before, but especially when you're in a professional setting. And I think the pressures on teachers mean that some of the time that they're not necessarily got the space in their own heads, and that people will just be like, right, get our head down, get through this, get through that. And if they're not looked after by their own school, that it's really hard to look after other children. Now, when you were in year 13, so after your dad had died, and something I'd really support for other schools, we did something called supervision, which makes it sound like we're sent off and we're watched and for being a bit hapless, but it wasn't that. We got to speak to a child psychologist. So I would go and I would talk mainly about you, really, and mainly about what I just said about not being able to fix it and what can I do. And she would give me some really good advice, and to be honest, a lot of it is what I was doing anyway, and a lot of it was me just sort of looking for reassurance that I was doing right by you, and that I was not always necessarily saying the right things, but that I was doing the best that I could, given the fact, as I keep going to, I couldn't fix it. And And I found that really, really useful. And I think if schools invest a bit more in supporting teachers to support children, because there is not necessarily a blueprint to how you manage these things. And I think your grief manifested itself in lots of different ways. I think, because I was listening to one of the podcasts earlier about, you know, when grief manifests itself in bad behavior and that, you know, kids acting out, and that's really hard to manage as a teacher. But that external help that I got, and I was given space to be able to access it, was amazing. I think in my job, and I'm in the pastoral side of it as well, I sort of have like these phone calls with parents sometimes, or you know, with children, and some of the conversations that we had, and I call them like, you know, like plaster conversations, where you just have to rip the plaster off, and I just take a deep breath and I just dive right in, because you can do a lot of dancing around stuff in life, can't you? But that's not always helping anybody. I like to think I can be quite tactful when I want to be. So yeah, I think for schools, if they can, you can't always you're never going to you're going to make mistakes. You're going to not necessarily say the right thing. But I think if you're trying, then kids see that, and that builds up the trust. Because there'll have been times in conversations with you where I definitely didn't say the right thing, and that I wouldn't have, well, maybe I contributed to being upset, or you know, there's points where afterwards I was like, oh, she definitely didn't want to hear that, or that wasn't the right time to make that comment. But that still doesn't mean that I would undo any of those conversations, because each one of those built on one another, didn't it? And it meant that if you didn't like or push back on something I'd said, I then knew that if there was a situation that was similar to that, or there was something on the horizon that had similar kind of triggers, I'd be like, right, well, she's not going to want to do that, so I can kind of get ahead of myself. And a lot of stuff we talked about with teachers as well was content that was uncomfortable for you. And I know when you're doing RS, and some big questions, theological questions that were hard, and just preempting that with a lot of people, and communicating with that, and it would change. You know, in lower school you didn't want to talk about it, and you didn't want people to ask you about it, and then when after he died, you were like, I hate that people don't bring him up, and I want people to talk about him. And so I think you telling me that, and me being able to share that with other people, empowered the other professionals around you to be able to be like, how are you feeling? Or tell you a funny story, and obviously unique to your situation, tell you a funny story about your dad, or just it not being a taboo.
Yeah.
Must be really hard for kids having to tell teachers every year on year, or like stuff like saying, you know, give this letter to your mum and dad and things like that. If you can get it's little things like that.
Yeah. I have a lot to say in response to that. Because it was such an overall positive experience, and because I think that open conversation for me especially is really important, if you ever did say anything that upset me or something, I don't remember it now. It's been 2 years, sure, but I don't remember it.
No, I don't remember specifics. I do remember
No.
being like, maybe I shouldn't have brought that up at that point, or, you know, but I don't regret any of that, and that doesn't bother me, because what I tried to stress with you a lot is that whatever you were feeling that day was valid. And I think you spent, again, I won't go into this detail, but you spent a lot of time being like, I don't want to bother people, or I don't want to upset people, or I don't want to make people feel uncomfortable, or I don't want to be angry at people, or I don't want to. And actually me just being like, well, it's all right, that's how you're feeling today, and that's valid. Yeah, I think that helps. Sorry, I cut you off. Terrible.
That's okay. Yeah, and I mean, this is the thing, is that, like, well, maybe, to be fair, I mean, some of the things you said probably did make me cry, but it was probably because I felt kind of seen. Like, if you're saying, oh, like, I had a lot of emotions, still do, but like, it's very normal, especially, or just, I don't know, when you're grieving, to just feel a bit overwhelmed, and I definitely did throughout sixth form. It was intense, and I think, like, it would just bubble over, but it wasn't like a straw that breaks the camel's back. It was like, okay, it's actually fine, and you know, I can talk about it, and that's what made me emotional, I think, sometimes, because it's just like, right, yeah, like you said, I can feel that, I can let it out, and that was important. So I think, yeah, like the emotions of those sorts of conversations are not at all necessarily a bad response. Like, it's not something to be worried about, because it's probably a real thing that would happen in those sorts of conversations when you're starting to approach grief with someone, but it's normal. And it's I just think, yeah, you're so right about saying something is better than saying nothing, because you are trying. Making sure that you try, and you try to acknowledge it, and acknowledge that it impacts them, or is impacting them, or has impacted them. And yeah, and rip off the plaster. Loving the metaphor, loving the analogy.
Oh, oh, some big words for me. Very good. Your dad would love that.
Yeah.
Did I tell you about the time he said allegory? And I pretended to know what it was. He's like, oh, that story's an allegory. And I was like, yes, it is an allegory. And we had to Google it afterwards.
It's okay. He used some sort of Shakespearean words.
What a guy.
Yeah, what a guy indeed. I remember when I was in lower school, and there was going to be a physics lesson or something, I don't know, about like radiology and in medicine. And I remember you sort of saying to me, oh, if you want to miss this, you can go say you have a flute lesson, and things like that. And at that particular moment in time, I thought, that is so nice of her to ask. But at the time, I didn't need to, for that specific context. Later, in different lessons in later years, I definitely did. But in that specific context, I was like, it's okay, it's physics. Like, I don't know. I was like, I'm gonna be fine in that lesson. But I didn't care that you'd asked. I was like, okay, I'm still, the reality is still being acknowledged. At the time, it was that my dad wasn't well. It's not like, oh no, a reminder. It's just the reality that's being acknowledged. And for people who are grieving, I think occasionally, maybe sometimes people would be like, oh, don't want to sort of remind them. But how are you going to forget? Like, I think, in your own head, sure, things are triggering, and that can be really difficult. But I do think that it is just better to say something than to say nothing at all. And I think that you did empower the other teachers a fair bit. I remember asking, actually, for everyone to acknowledge, like all my subject teachers, which isn't that many, it's like 6, to just stay behind after like the first class and say something, because I just couldn't bear to not be speaking about it when I knew that everyone knew. And I appreciated, in the few months after and things, like maybe occasionally, like, again, grammar police or things, like you end up sort of talking about my dad a little bit as well. And I think as the months went on, I still got really excited anytime anyone wanted to talk about not just my dad, but also like maybe like check in and just acknowledge it. And still to this day, I think that's the biggest thing for me, is that I just want people to acknowledge that they know. They don't have to listen to my deepest, darkest, saddest moments. They just need to acknowledge that something bad happened, or that they know that my dad's not here anymore, or something like that. I don't like to use such euphemistic language either, but sometimes you accidentally do. But the main message of that is that it's better to say something than to say nothing, if you possibly can, and not worry about saying the right thing too much, because you're more likely to sort of have a positive impact by saying something if you do it in a tactful way, and not a offhand, which I'm sure that people nowadays wouldn't. But just a little bit of acknowledgement is really good.
I think with you, and again, more generally, whenever a child is experiencing trauma or whatever you want to call it, it might be, right, you got to tell me if I'm using the word exceptional in the right context here. It might be exceptional to you, and I don't mean in a good way. So, like, I wasn't experiencing that specific grief. For me, like saying, like, oh, do you want to go to this physics lesson because they're talking about having chemo and things, like that to me was, a quite a sensitive topic. But for you and for other kids, that's their normal. And by denying that their normal is happening, and that's the reality of their situation, doesn't mean that it goes away, doesn't mean that it gets any better. You're just not acknowledging the reality that that child and that you were existing in. It doesn't mean that it gets any better just because you don't talk about it.
Yeah, exactly. It's definitely still there. And so I just think having an extra pair of ears or an extra sort of witness to those sorts of emotions, or even, just the acknowledgement. I've known Emily for such a long time that once my dad died, it didn't feel like a big step to go to her, for example. I mean, obviously she reached out to me first and I'd already been going to her for years. So it's a lot of people don't automatically have that support. And so for any students, pupils, kids, young people who are bereaved, who are going through grief, whether it's recent or not, I think for a lot of people, it's good to just have it out there, and then at least they know that you don't want to talk about it, for example, so that then you don't get asked things. Or, like, this is what we talk about in the Ask Me campaign, is that everyone's needs are very different. So I'm talking a lot about having open conversations with my teachers and with everyone. And for a lot of people, that's not necessarily the case. It's they'll have different ways of expressing their grief. I know people I'm close to in my family and things, they don't grieve the same way I do at all. And so, that's why it's important to just have a little bit of awareness. And in the Ask Me campaign, there is a bereavement plan that you can use if you want, and just, or even, not as necessarily to put in for every single person, because it's a big change to make and things like that. But if you're just stuck with somewhere to start, it's sort of like, it's good to know whether the child wants to talk about it or not and things like that. But it's good to have that knowledge in your head rather than assuming one way or another, and rather than trying to, dance around it, like you said. So for anybody that is bereaved and doesn't know where to start with trying to reach out to their teachers to have these conversations about what they might need or not need, I would say keep trying. I think it probably is really discouraging when you're not getting the support that you want, but there hopefully will be someone in your school or college or setting who would get it. And so keep trying, and don't be afraid to reach out. That's a really hard step to take, but I would just sort of say keep trying, because it might pay off. Because I can't imagine not having the relationship that I had with my teachers. But I think just trying to make any connection that you can, even just trying to identify one person who's a bit more approachable or something like that. And if it is through like an email or something online, like a lot of times that helps, because you don't have to sort of go and have a really awkward conversation. I'd never want to tell people who are grieving to try and advocate for themselves, because that's not necessarily how it should have to be. But if you're in a position where you need to, or you want to just be in an open conversation with your school or college or anything about it, just go for it. Take the leap of faith, rip the plaster off, and yeah, because you never know, it might really help. If I remember my other piece of advice, I'll let you know.
I think, I'm just thinking for teachers, because it's like we said, we were in a really strong position to support you when you lost your dad, when he died. And I think if you don't have that, if you're head of year or you're form tutor or you're in a pastoral capacity, whatever capacity, if you don't have that to start with, I think I would say to start to offer the practical support. So if you don't have that relationship where you can get deep and chat about, your innermost feelings, like we did in the Dobby cupboard, but okay, well, what is it you need? Right, okay, well, you need your teachers to know this, right? So what do you want your teachers to know? Right, well, I'll make sure they know that. How are you feeling about this topic, or how are you feeling about this lesson? And not in those very specific contexts of grief, but in my experience, particularly, you were always in tune with how you were feeling to a point. You couldn't always articulate it, but you could always say, I feel like this. I don't know why, but I feel like this. I'm always surprised at the kind of conversations you can have, even with 11-year-olds, where they, given the space and given the forum, can say, this is what I need, this is how I feel. I think possibly younger generations to millennials and older are much better doing that than our generation. I think there's a lot more sense of self, or a lot more sense of like self-care. I think in some ways, I think that trying to baby a child doesn't always work. And I think particularly I'm always impressed at how kids can advocate for themselves, and given the space, how well they can articulate how they're feeling. And even if they can't articulate their feeling, they're very good at articulating their needs. Needs and wants are different, obviously, and as adults in that capacity, we need to say, well, this actually, as a child, this is what you need right now. What we don't want is a trauma at whatever age to then impact your education, which then can impact the rest of your life. And we have that pragmatic side of things where we need to, particularly at secondary, we need to be thinking about your qualifications and next steps. And I know we did that with you. But if we can be thinking about the practical side of things, if you don't have that relationship, going back to that point, if you don't have that relationship, it's okay.
Yeah.
I would be trying to problem solve for them, and tearing up the rule book a little bit, like within reason, and showing that you're human and showing your human side. And I think in teaching, and depending on what school setting you're in and the context you're in, sometimes it becomes a bit robotic. But actually showing that you're a person, you're a human being, goes a really long way, I think.
So, as we come to the end of this very insightful episode, I was just wondering if you had any reflections on what the wider importance of this conversation is, and why is this conversation, this podcast and sharing our experiences been important?
I think that sometimes for teachers that you can lose sight, and it's like one of those cheesy teaching adverts that you see, where it's like every lesson makes a difference. And I always sort of see those and think, possibly. But I think there's times in children's lives and there's times in everybody's lives where you are in such you have the power to transform what that experience, already horrible experience, becomes for that child. And I think that our conversation, our relationship, our story so beautiful, attest to that. And that it's coincidence that I was 7P's form tutor, and that I was working at that school at that time, and you were somebody that I identified as needing me, and I made it my goal to do whatever that child needs. Probably couldn't, I don't know, help you with any of your academic stuff because you're far cleverer. Yeah.
Not true.
Particularly at A-level, not a clue. Anyway, I made it my my goal to. I couldn't fix the main issue. I couldn't make your dad better. I couldn't sort that. But what I could do was just make the stuff that didn't have to be complicated uncomplicated for you. And I could do that legwork. And I was in the position that I could fix that stuff. As a teacher, it's and as a person, I can see why you would instinctively sort of step back from that situation. But we are in a position where if we lean in, that the impact of leaning in and the impact of just complete and unwavering support for that kid can have such a huge impact on that child's life, that having this conversation and the Ask Me campaign and everything is so important, because grief is so specific and grief is so personal. And each one of those experiences and each one of those interventions and each one of the teacher-child relationship that we have is going to be different, but they're so important. And that's the privilege of being a teacher, that you get to work with these kids and you get to make that difference. I know I keep saying things that are quite generic and maybe quite obvious, but if there's anything else I can offer, or people that, if I can help in any other way, I would love to do that. And I'm also not finished learning myself. I'm by no means an expert on this. I use instinct a lot. I think I've got quite a good instinct by now. I've been doing this for a long time, but there's not necessarily a rule book that I use, and I'm still learning and I still want to know more. And not complacent with that. But if there's anything more I can offer, then I'd be very happy to. Here for you.
Yay! Thank you.
Yay!
Yeah, I think it is just really important to know that the positive impact that you could have, like, in having that conversation, whether you're a student worrying about reaching out or whether you're a teacher worrying about reaching out, the positive impact that you could have is probably bigger than you think, maybe, or, you know, it's definitely worth it. And I think from talking to the youth team, because we were trying to think about the campaign and how we can encourage more people to have a positive experience, people say, you know, I wish that this is how it had been for me. And they say, I wish people had asked me, hence the name, Ask Me. And I think it's just worth a try, really. And I think, yeah, I don't have anything else to say other than that I'm really glad that we were able to have this conversation. And I'm very, very grateful, not just for the support that you gave me while I was at school, but for the fact that you have been so open about it on this podcast. I don't think I really realised until we started doing the Ask Me campaign with Winston's Wish how important it could be, because this was just my experience and I definitely sort of not took it for granted, but it was all that I knew. And I think, yeah, it was a really sort of shocking thing to realise that it was so different for other people. If we can try to change that, and if, you know, anything that has been said in this conversation helps people to make a little start in trying to change that and have these open conversations, then I think that's really important. Big thank you, really. Thank you to Emily for being on the podcast.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
No problem.
I think we've sounded relatively competent, Miranda.
So thanks for listening to Grief in Common. For support, resources, or to donate and help us keep creating, visit winstonswish.org. Bye!